The first log went upright, not sideways, and that was when the laughing started. They didn't even wait for her to set the second one. A couple of men coming back from the creek slowed their horses, tipped their hats back, and stared like they were watching someone dig a grave in the wrong direction. One of them snorted. Another shook his head and said it out loud, like it needed saying. "Tall and skinny," he called. "What are you building? A chimney you plan to live in?" The widow didn't answer. She kept her back to them, boots sunk into half-frozen mud, palms burning as she wrestled the log into place. The wind cut down from the ridge and slid straight through her coat like it wasn't there. She felt it on her spine, sharp and patient. Winter was already testing the valley, even if the snow hadn't come yet. Her name was Clara Hensley, and 3 weeks earlier she had buried her husband in ground so hard the shovel rang like iron. Now she was building a cabin no one recognized as a cabin at all. It rose narrow, like a stack of breath held in, only one room wide. No long walls, no low roof stretching out to catch snow. The corners went up fast, faster than anyone was used to seeing, and every log she lifted made the shape stranger. People gathered. They always did when something didn't make sense. By the second day, there were comments. By the third, advice. By the fourth, jokes sharp enough to draw blood if she let them. "You'll freeze," one woman said, not unkindly, holding a basket of apples against her hip. "Heat rises, dear. You want it wide so it stays with you." A man laughed outright. "She's building a grave turned on end." Someone else added, "Wind'll tear it apart. Tall things catch wind." Clara said nothing. She kept measuring with a knotted string. She kept cutting notches tighter than most men bothered with. She stacked the logs so close you could barely slide a blade between them. At night she went back to the tent she'd pitched beside the old cottonwood and lay awake listening to her children breathe. 2 boys and a girl, all thin from the long sickness that had taken their father slow. When the wind shifted, the canvas snapped like a whip and the cold crept under the blankets no matter how she tucked them. She didn't sleep much. In the mornings, frost glazed the ground silver, and by afternoon it was gone again, like a warning that could still be ignored if you wanted. The other settlers were finishing their cabins the way they always had. Long, squat, star roofs already sagging under the weight of early snow. Smoke curled from chimneys that bled heat straight into the sky. Clara watched that smoke more than anything else. It rose fast, too fast. It vanished into the cold air like breath wasted. That was the thing they didn't understand about her cabin. They thought it was about height. They thought she was being stubborn or foolish or proud, but she was building to slow the leaving. The land she'd been given sat lower than the rest, closer to the creek where cold pooled at night like water. Her husband had cursed it the first winter they spent there, said the chill climbed out of the ground and slept with them, said no fire ever seemed to last. He'd been right. She remembered nights sitting up, feeding the stove until her hands cracked and bled, only to feel the warmth slide away the moment she turned her back. The wide walls bled it. The long roof drank it. By dawn, the fire was ash, and the cold was waiting, patient as ever. After he died, she went back through his old notes, scraps of paper with numbers and half ideas. He'd been a man who thought in lines and measures. She found one page folded so many times it was soft as cloth. On it, a simple drawing, not wide, tall, less surface, less escape. She didn't tell anyone that. She just built. By the end of the first week, the structure stood higher than any cabin on the row. People stopped laughing and started watching instead, the way you do when you're no longer sure you're right. Children came first, circling it like a curiosity. One boy pressed his ear to the wall and frowned. "It's quiet," he said, like that meant something. The men noticed the way the logs fit, the way the corners didn't gape, the way the seams disappeared once she packed them tight with clay and straw. They noticed the door was smaller, the windows narrow slits set higher than usual. "Dark in there," someone muttered. Clara overheard and nodded once to herself. Dark meant less glass. Less glass meant less cold crawling in after sunset. On the 9th day, the first real snow came early, thick and sudden. It fell straight down, no warning, turning the valley white before noon. The laughter stopped entirely then. Everyone rushed to finish roofs, to cover stacks of wood, to get inside. Clara worked through it, snow collecting in her hair, shoulders aching. She set the last roof beam as the light went flat and grey. The roof itself was steep, almost severe, shedding snow as fast as it landed. That night she lit the first fire inside the narrow cabin. The room was tall, the ceiling close enough to feel, but high enough to breathe. The stove sat centered, not shoved against a wall. The flue ran straight up, not wandering, not dragging heat sideways and out. She fed it 3 pieces of wood, then she waited. The children huddled close, boots still on, eyes wide. Clara watched the walls. She watched the ceiling. She watched the way the warmth moved, not rushing up and away, not flattening out and dying. It stayed. The heat climbed, yes, but slowly. It folded back on itself. It lingered. The air near the floor warmed instead of staying cruel and sharp. The corners didn't bleed it out. The roof didn't drink it. By morning, the fire was low, but the room was still warm enough to breathe without pain. Clara sat on the floor and let herself cry once, quietly, so the children wouldn't hear. Outside, smoke rose from the other cabins, thick and constant. Men were already chopping more wood, breath coming hard, faces tight. Winter had arrived earlier than expected, and it was hungry. Someone passed Clara's place and slowed, then stopped. No smoke poured from her chimney, just a thin thread, lazy, like it wasn't in a hurry to leave. By noon there was a knock at her door. Not laughter, not advice, a question. She opened it and felt the cold press forward, testing her threshold. The man standing there glanced past her into the tall, narrow room, eyes flicking to the stove, the walls, the ceiling. "How many logs you burn last night?" he asked. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the snow piling up against the doorframe, at the way the wind slid around the cabin instead of hammering it. "Enough," she said finally. Behind him, the valley kept freezing, and people were starting to notice where the warmth wasn't escaping. The knock at Clara's door changed everything, though no one would have said that out loud yet. The man who stood there, Eli Mercer, broad-backed, red-faced from chopping since dawn, didn't step inside. He didn't need to. The warmth reached him anyway, subtle but undeniable, sliding out past Clara's boots and brushing his ankles like something alive. He noticed. His jaw tightened, just a little. "That fire still going?" he asked. Clara glanced back once. The stove gave off no roar, no violent crackle, just a steady, contained heat, the kind that didn't beg to be fed every hour. "Went out sometime before sunrise," she said. Eli stared at her, then past her, then up, really up, tracking the height of the walls, the narrowness of the space. He scratched his beard, left a white streak of frost in it. "Huh," was all he said. By afternoon, 3 more people had found reasons to walk past her place. One stopped to retie a boot, another pretended to look for a lost glove. A woman lingered longer than polite, eyes drifting to the chimney, frowning when she saw how little smoke came from it. Clara kept busy. She stacked the last of the wood she'd split weeks earlier, when her hands still had strength in them and the ground wasn't locked hard. She packed more clay into the seams where the logs met the roof, pressing it in with numb fingers, sealing every small betrayal the cold might find. She didn't invite anyone in, not yet. That night the temperature dropped fast. The kind of cold that arrives like a door slamming shut. By dusk, the creek groaned under a skin of ice. By full dark, the air burned to breathe. In the long, wide cabins down the row, fires raged bright, too bright. Men fed them until their arms ached, trying to push warmth into spaces that refused to hold it. Chimneys pulled hard, dragging heat up and out, smoke racing skyward like it was glad to escape. Clara fed her stove once, just once. She banked the coals carefully, set the damper the way her husband used to insist on, and sat with her children until their shoulders loosened and their breathing slowed. The heat didn't vanish when the fire settled. It softened, spread, stayed low enough that the floor no longer bit through the soles of their socks. Her daughter fell asleep leaning against the wall. Clara noticed then something she hadn't planned but couldn't ignore. The walls themselves felt warm, not hot, never that, but gently holding what they'd been given. The narrowness meant less wall to lose heat through. The height meant the warm air had room to slow, to turn back instead of rushing away. It wasn't magic, it was restraint. Outside, the wind howled down from the ridge, finding every crack and weakness it could. It rattled shutters, it slid under doors, it lifted snow and threw it sideways, piling it against walls like a threat. Clara's cabin shuddered once, then settled. The wind slipped around it, confused, robbed of long surfaces to push against. Somewhere before dawn, she woke to shouting. Not close, not panicked yet, but urgent enough to cut through sleep. She rose, pulled on her coat, and cracked the door. Down the row, a glow pulsed too bright against the snow. Someone had lost control of their stove. Sparks spat from a chimney, lifting into the dark like fireflies. Men ran with buckets, boots sliding, breath tearing out of them in white clouds. The fire burned itself out eventually. Most fires did. What remained was the cold and the sudden sharp understanding that winter wasn't going to be reasonable this year. By morning, the jokes were gone entirely. Eli Mercer came back, this time with his wife. She didn't pretend to linger. She stepped straight up onto the stoop, eyes wide, hands tucked into her sleeves like she was trying to keep herself from stealing something. "Can we come in?" she asked. Clara hesitated, not because she didn't want them inside, but because she knew the moment she let one person cross that threshold, the valley would follow. Still, she stepped aside. The Mercers entered and stopped short. It wasn't lavish. It wasn't comfortable by any measure that mattered in summer. There was no extra space, no wide table, no place to pace or sprawl, but it was warm. Warm without effort. Mrs. Mercer closed her eyes without realizing she'd done it. Her shoulders sagged. "Oh," she breathed, like she'd been holding herself together with string, and someone had finally cut it. Eli walked the room slowly, palm trailing along the wall. Up the height of it, he looked at the ceiling, the flue, the way the stove sat centered like a heart instead of a desperate afterthought. "How much wood?" he asked again. Clara told him. He did the math in his head and frowned, then frowned harder. "That don't make sense," he said. "It does," Clara replied. "If you stop letting the heat run." He looked at her then, really looked, not as a widow, not as a woman who'd done something strange, but as someone who might have seen what he hadn't. By midday, word had moved faster than Clara would have liked. People came with reasons, with questions dressed up as compliments, with skepticism that had softened into something closer to hunger. They didn't all fit inside. Most stood on the stoop, feeling the warmth spill out, touching the door frame, the walls, testing like it might vanish if they didn't confirm it themselves. One man laughed weakly. "You'll choke on smoke in a place like this." Clara shook her head. "Straight flue. Short pull. It goes when it needs to, not before." Another frowned at the windows. "Too small. Less glass to steal heat," she said. A woman pressed her boot to the floor and frowned. "Why's the cold not biting up from the ground?" Clara hadn't expected that question. She paused, then answered honestly. "Because the air stays long enough to warm it." They left with more questions than answers. That afternoon, the sky went flat and white again. Snow started falling with no wind this time. Thick and quiet, smothering sound. The temperature dropped another notch, like winter tightening its grip. Down the row, axes rang, woodpiles shrank, smoke thickened. At Clara's place, the chimney breathed easy. That night, someone knocked hard enough to rattle the door. When Clara opened it, Mrs. Holloway stood there with her youngest bundled against her chest, eyes bright with something close to fear. "Our fire won't hold," she said. "We've fed it all day." It won't hold." Clara looked past her at the wide, low cabin behind, smoke tearing out of the chimney like it was being chased. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said, and just like that, her narrow, tall cabin stopped being a curiosity and became a refuge. By the third night, Clara's cabin no longer felt like hers alone. It hadn't been said outright, but the understanding moved through the valley the same way cold did, quietly, settling into places people didn't check until it was already there. The narrow, tall cabin was holding something the others couldn't. Not just warmth, but time. Mrs. Holloway's youngest slept against Clara's wall, with his cheek pressed flat to the wood, mouth open, breath steady. The boy's fingers were pink again, instead of waxy white. Clara noticed that first. She always noticed the children first. The adults tried not to stare. They stood too straight, too still, like guests afraid of wearing out their welcome. Someone had brought a pot of stew. Another offered bread gone stiff at the edges. No one asked how long they could stay. They didn't need to. Outside, the temperature dropped again. The snow that had fallen soft and quiet earlier in the day hardened into something sharp underfoot. The wind returned after dark, sliding down the ridge with a low, steady sound, like water pouring through a narrow cut. It found the other cabins easily. Doors rattled, smoke backdrafted, chimneys moaned as hot air raced upward and away, taking what little warmth it could with it. In one cabin, a stove cracked from being fed too hard, iron popping like a gunshot. In another, a man burned through half his woodpile before midnight and still couldn't stop his breath from fogging inside his own home. Clara fed her stove once. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a show of it. She simply opened the iron door, slid in 2 split pieces, and closed it again. The fire caught slowly, deliberately. No rush. No roar. The warmth spread the way it always did now, down first, settling into the floorboards, easing the ache out of feet and knees before it climbed. Mrs. Holloway noticed. "It comes up different," she said softly, almost to herself. Clara nodded. "Because it's not leaving as fast." That was the part most of them still didn't understand. They'd grown up believing heat was something you chased, something you fought to keep from running away. They built wide, fed fires hard, punched holes through roofs and walls for smoke to escape, and watched the warmth flee along with it. Clara's cabin didn't chase heat, it trapped it gently, the way cupped hands trap breath. Someone asked that night why she hadn't built a loft, with the ceiling so high. Clara answered honestly, "Because people sleep where it's warmest, and I didn't want it all above their heads." The room was tall, yes, but not wasted. The warm air slowed as it rose, pooled instead of racing, folded back down the walls. The narrow shape meant less surface for cold to bite into, less wall to bleed through, less roof to steal upward. By morning, the children woke without crying. That alone would have been enough. The sun came pale and weak through the high windows, barely warming the snow outside. Clara stepped onto the stoop and took in the valley. Smoke still rose, but there was more of it than yesterday, more urgency in it. The sound of axes carried farther now, echoing sharp and hollow. She counted 3 cabins, already low on wood. Eli Mercer met her halfway down the row, boots crunching, shoulders hunched. He didn't waste time. "You're going to have more coming," he said. Holloways told the Price family. Prices told the Thompsons. Thompsons don't make it through another night like last. Clara nodded. She already knew. "I can't fit everyone," she said. Eli grimaced. "I know." They stood there a moment, the cold pressing in like it was listening. "Show me," Eli said finally, "how you set the flue, how you stack the walls. I don't need it done for me. I just need to understand what I did wrong." Clara studied him. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was asking for a chance. "Tonight," she said, "when it's dark, when you can feel what's leaving." That night, they stood in his cabin with the fire roaring too hot, air stinging their eyes, smoke pulling hard. Clara pointed, not lecturing, just observing. "Feel the floor," she said. Cold bit through the soles of their boots. "Your heat's running," she continued. "Up and out. You're feeding it to keep up." Eli cursed under his breath. She showed him the cracks he hadn't sealed, the wide stretch of roof bleeding warmth, the long walls acting like open hands. "You built for space," she said, "not for holding." They went back to her cabin after, stepped inside. Let the contrast speak for itself. Eli didn't talk for a long time. By morning, he'd already torn part of his flue apart. Others followed. They couldn't rebuild completely, not now. Not with the ground frozen and supplies thin, but they made changes. They narrowed doorways, they blocked unused windows, they shortened flues, some even built temporary inner walls, ugly but tighter, trying to reduce the space their heat had to defend. Not everyone listened. 2 cabins down, old Mr. Kersey refused outright, said he'd lived through worse winters than this, said women's tricks didn't beat experience. That night, his fire went out before dawn. They found him alive, barely, fingers stiff and lips blue, breath shallow as a child's. They carried him into Clara's cabin on a door pulled off its hinges. He didn't wake until the warmth had soaked into him slow, careful. When he did, he wept. No one mocked Clara after that. The storm that came next wasn't loud. It was worse than that. It arrived silent and steady, snow falling thick enough to erase distance, wind pressing just enough to steal what heat it could find. The valley disappeared under white, familiar shapes, turning strange and small. Cabins that had seemed solid shrank under it, roofs bowed, chimneys iced, doors froze shut. Clara's cabin stood narrow against it, shedding snow, walls tight, heat held close like a secret. People came in shifts now, children first, then the elderly, then those whose fires had failed or whose wood was gone. They didn't argue about it. They didn't have the strength. Clara organized without raising her voice, sleeping against the walls where it was warmest, rotating places, feeding the stove just enough, never more. The firewood pile dropped, but slowly, far more slowly than anyone expected. One night, as the storm pressed hardest, Eli stood near the door and shook his head. "If you'd built wide," he said quietly, "we'd be done." Clara didn't answer. She watched the children sleep. She listened to the wind slide uselessly around the walls. Outside, the storm took what it could. Inside, the heat stayed. The storm did not break the way storms were supposed to. There was no single night where it screamed itself empty and moved on. No sudden quiet that meant relief. Instead, it lingered, pressed down on the valley day after day, snow falling just enough to keep doors sealed and paths erased, cold tightening its grip in small, patient increments. That was when the narrow cabin was tested hardest, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the long stretch of time where mistakes usually showed themselves. Clara's firewood stack thinned, not quickly, but visibly now. Anyone watching could tell she was spending something precious. What unsettled people was how slowly it went compared to their own. In the other cabins, men burned through weeks of wood in days. They fed fires too hot, chasing warmth that fled the moment they turned away. Iron stoves glowed dull red, chimneys iced over and had to be beaten clear. Smoke filled rooms, then vanished, taking heat with it. In Clara's cabin, the stove stayed dark more often than not. That made people nervous. "You should feed it," Mrs. Price whispered one evening, glancing at the iron door as if it might accuse them. "It's too quiet." Clara shook her head. "If it's quiet, it's working." They were packed in closer now, children along the walls, adults seated or standing where they could without blocking the flow of warmth. The air stayed warm enough that breath didn't fog unless someone came in from outside. That, more than anything, unnerved the men. Heat was supposed to be loud, violent, demanding. This kind of warmth felt unnatural to them, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't ask for constant attention. One night the wind shifted. It came down the ridge at a new angle, striking the row of cabins broadside. Wide walls took the blow full on. Nails shrieked, boards flexed. Snow drove into seams and froze there, forcing them wider by morning. Clara felt the change before she heard it. The pressure moved differently around her cabin, split, redirected. The narrow face took less of the push. The height gave the wind nowhere to settle. Still, something groaned. A sound ran through the valley, wood under strain, then a crack. Someone shouted. Boots pounded outside. Clara opened the door and felt the cold lunge for her, eager. 2 cabins down, part of a roof had collapsed inward under the weight of snow driven against it. Not fully, just enough to spill heat out into the storm and let the cold rush in like water through a breach. They brought the family to her place in silence. The father carried his youngest, the child wrapped in a quilt stiff with frost. The mother followed, numb-eyed, lips trembling but dry. She didn't cry yet. Crying came later when you were safe enough to feel it. Inside Clara's cabin, the warmth did its quiet work. Hands regained color, breathing slowed. The shock eased back just enough that the mother sank to her knees and pressed her forehead to the floorboards, whispering thanks to no one in particular. Clara put more wood in the stove that night. Not much, just enough. She watched how the heat spread, still even, still controlled. The walls drank it slowly. The ceiling held it without stealing. The floor lost its bite. But she also noticed something else now. With so many bodies inside, the room warmed faster and stayed warm longer. People themselves became part of the holding. It wasn't comfortable knowledge. It meant responsibility. By the 5th day of the storm, no one questioned where they would go if their fire failed. They came to Clara. No one said it outright. But the narrow cabin had become the center of the valley, not because it was largest, but because it wasted the least. Eli Mercer approached her that morning with a look she recognized too well, a look men wore when pride had finally lost. "We need to talk about wood," he said. She nodded. "I know." They stood by the door, keeping their voices low. Outside, the snow had drifted so high it nearly swallowed the lower walls of the other cabins. Smoke rose weak and thin from chimneys that struggled to pull. "My stack's almost gone," Eli admitted, "and I'm not the worst of it." Clara did the math in her head. How many nights they could stretch, how little she could feed the stove and still hold the heat, how many bodies the room could support before it became dangerous in a different way. "We ration," she said, "and we change who burns." Eli frowned. "Change?" "Cabins that still have wood burn during the day," she explained. "Low fires, enough to keep the worst out. At night, they come here. We burn 1 fire instead of 6. He stared at her, then slowly nodded. That was the night the valley truly understood what she had built. Not a shelter, a solution. Men who would never have listened before followed her instructions now without complaint. Fires were choked down, doors sealed. People moved at dusk, gathering quietly, carrying what little food and bedding they could manage. The narrow cabin filled, emptied, filled again in cycles. Children slept in shifts. Adults leaned against walls, sitting, standing, watching the stove like it might betray them if they blinked. It didn't. The heat stayed. On the 7th night, the cold reached its deepest point. No one knew the number. They didn't have instruments for that. They only knew the air outside burned skin within seconds, and the snow squeaked underfoot like dry leather. Inside, Clara's cabin remained warm enough that the youngest slept with their hands free of blankets. Someone laughed once, quietly, like they'd surprised themselves. Then, finally, the storm broke, not with noise, with absence. The wind died first. Then the snow thinned. The sky cleared to a brittle blue that hurt to look at. The cold remained, but it loosened, just enough to breathe. People stepped outside cautiously, like the world might shatter if they moved too fast. Cabins stood, some damaged, some barely, but the valley had not been emptied. They turned back toward Clara's place as one. Eli spoke for them. "You saved us." Clara shook her head. "I didn't," she said. "The cabin did." He corrected her gently. "You built it." She looked at the narrow walls, the tall shape that had drawn laughter and doubt. She thought of her husband's folded paper, of heat she had finally learned not to chase. "Not alone," she said. Behind them, smoke rose again, this time slower, steadier, and none of it rushed the way it used to. The valley did not return to normal after the storm. It couldn't. Snow still lay thick in the low places, packed hard as bone. Roofs bore scars, patched planks, crooked lines where weight had shifted. Wood piles stood thinner, measured now with care instead of confidence. People moved differently too, slower, quieter, as if winter had leaned close enough to whisper something they could not unhear. Clara noticed it first in the way men stood outside her cabin long after they no longer needed to. They would pause there, hands tucked under their arms, eyes tracing the narrow walls upward, not judging anymore, measuring, remembering. No one laughed. A week after the sky cleared, Eli Mercer came with a notebook folded awkwardly in his coat. He didn't open it right away. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what to change before next winter." Clara nodded. "So have I." They walked the valley together, past cabins that had burned themselves nearly empty, past chimneys that still pulled too hard, past wide rooms that felt cold even with a fire going. She didn't lecture. She didn't need to. She pointed when something mattered, a corner where wind pooled, a roofline that caught snow instead of shedding it, a long wall bleeding warmth into the air like an open wound. "Less surface," she said once. "Less escape." The words spread faster than any sermon. By late winter, temporary fixes appeared. Inner walls built ugly but tight, flues shortened, doors sealed down to the smallest opening people could tolerate. Fires burned lower, longer, instead of roaring themselves empty. Wood lasted. When spring finally came, it arrived shy and uncertain. Snow melted in patches, then froze again. The creek broke its ice with a sound like tearing cloth. Mud swallowed boots whole. People survived to complain about it. That mattered more than they said. When the ground softened enough to dig, men came to Clara, not with questions this time, but with requests. "Will you show me how you set the corners? Can you look at my plan before I start? I don't want it wide anymore." She never said yes all at once. She made them wait, made them think, made them understand what they were giving up in space to gain in warmth. Some backed out, most didn't. That summer the valley changed shape, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a thought settling in. New cabins rose narrower, taller, roofs steepened, windows shrank, flues ran straighter. Men cursed less about drafts and more about precision. They learned to cut tighter joints, to seal instead of shrug. Someone joked once, weakly, that Clara was starting a trend. No one laughed. Clara rebuilt parts of her own cabin too. She reinforced what had held, tightened what could be tighter still. She added nothing that didn't serve a purpose. No excess, no waste. When the first cold wind of the next winter slid down the ridge, it found fewer places to take hold. Smoke rose slower across the valley, thinner, calmer. Fires burned less wood and gave more in return. People slept longer. On the coldest night of that second winter, Clara sat alone by her stove, feeding it one split log. She watched the flame catch, steady and contained. She listened to the quiet, the absence of panic, of pounding on doors, of shouted fear in the dark. She thought of that first day, the laughter, the jokes thrown carelessly, like the cold itself had been nothing more than an inconvenience. She stood and laid her palm against the wall, warm, not hot, not fragile, just held. Outside, the valley breathed slow and even, cabins standing narrow and tall against the night. Heat no longer escaped the way it once had, and neither did the people.